Black pastor's last sermon stuns congregation with divine miracle. Pastor James Wilson's hands trembled as he gripped the wooden pulpit. The magnificent stained glass windows of Grace Baptist Church cast colored shadows across his face, highlighting the tears that now streamed down his weathered cheeks. The congregation sat in stunned silence, many with mouths agape, others with hands covering their faces. "I've kept this secret for 40 years, Pastor Wilson said, his voice cracking. "And I never thought. I never imagined that God would reveal it like this. Not today, not during my last sermon." The old pastor looked to his right, where a young man stood frozen in shock, his face ashen. The teenager's name was Marcus Johnson, and he had come to the church that morning only because his grandmother had insisted. He hadn't expected to be standing before the entire congregation, hadn't expected to be at the center of what many would later call a miracle. Behind Marcus stood Mrs. Alois Jackson, the church's eldest member at 93 years old. Her walking cane had clattered to the floor moments earlier, and now she pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, then at Pastor Wilson. "Lord, have mercy," she whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "It's him, the spitting image. Lord, have mercy." The sanctuary had gone from celebration to chaos in seconds. What had begun as Pastor Wilson's retirement ceremony after 30 years of service had turned into something no one could have predicted. The white envelope that had been delivered to the pulpit mid-sermon now lay open on the floor, its contents changing everything. Pastor Wilson looked out at the sea of confused faces, his heart pounding so hard he feared it might give out right there. He was 72 years old with a heart condition, and the doctor had warned him about stress. But this was beyond anything he could have prepared for. "I know you all have questions," he said, struggling to regain his composure. "I have them too, but let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when... But let's go back to how this all started. It was just 3 hours earlier when Pastor James Wilson woke up in his modest home on Maple Street, the same home he and his late wife Martha had purchased back in 1982. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains Martha had sewn herself, curtains that were now faded after decades of washing. James ran his hand across the empty space beside him in the bed, a habit he hadn't broken in the 7 years since Martha's passing. "Today's the day, Martha," he said to the empty room. 30 years at Grace Baptist. Can you believe it?" He moved slowly, his arthritic knees protesting as he made his way to the bathroom. His reflection in the mirror showed a man whose dark skin had gained a distinguished ashen quality over the years, whose once black hair was now completely white. But his eyes... Martha always said his eyes had remained the same since the day they met at a civil rights march in 1968. The radio on his bedside table played an oldies station, and Marvin Gaye's "What's Going On" filled the room. James hummed along as he carefully laid out his best suit, the one he'd worn to Martha's funeral, to their daughter Leanne's college graduation, and now to his final sermon as pastor of Grace Baptist Church. As he dressed, he thought about the sermon he had prepared. It wasn't what he had originally planned. For weeks, he had intended to reminisce about his 3 decades of service, to thank the congregation for their support, to offer wisdom to the young pastor Michael Taylor who would be taking his place. But last night, unable to sleep, James had felt compelled to write something different, something more personal, a testimony about faith during times of doubt, about the secrets we keep and the burdens we carry. "Lord, give me strength today," he prayed as he knotted his tie, the blue one Martha had given him for their 40th anniversary. "Help me speak your truth," she called out when she saw him. "We've got a special number for you today, a little surprise." "Can't wait to hear it, Sister Campbell," James replied with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. In his office, James found a stack of cards and gifts from congregation members. He set them aside, unable to focus on such tokens of appreciation when his mind was consumed by what he might have to face today. He closed the door, took out his Bible, and retrieved the letter. The law firm of Bradley, Wung, and Associates was searching for the biological father of one Marcus Johnson, age 17. The boy's mother, Vanessa Johnson, had passed away 3 months ago from cancer, and in her final days, she had revealed to her son that the man he had thought was his father actually wasn't. Before dying, Vanessa had given her son a name, James Wilson, and mentioned that he had been a theology student in Atlanta in the spring of 1989. James closed his eyes, the memories flooding back. He had indeed been a theology student in Atlanta in 1989. And he had known a woman named Vanessa. It had been a brief relationship during a time when he and Martha were separated, a dark period in his life when he had questioned everything, including his calling to ministry. When he and Martha reconciled that summer, he had put that time behind him, had never spoken of it to anyone. He had no idea that relationship had produced a child. A knock on the door startled him. It was Sister Alois Jackson, the church's eldest member and the woman who had first suggested James for the pastor position 3 decades ago. "May I come in, Pastor?" she asked, her voice still strong despite her 93 years. Alois walked with a cane now, but her mind was as sharp as ever, and her spiritual intuition was something James had come to rely on over the years. "Of course, Sister Jackson," he said, quickly tucking the letter back into his Bible. Alois settled into the chair across from his desk, studying him with eyes that seemed to see right through him. "The Lord woke me up at 4 a.m. this morning," she said. "Told me to pray for you, not for your sermon or your retirement, but for you, James Wilson. Said you'd be facing a reckoning today." James felt a chill run down his spine. Alois had always had an uncanny way of discerning things, a gift of prophecy that some in the church found unsettling, but that James had learned to respect. "I don't know what's coming," she continued, "but I know the Lord said to tell you this. Truth may hurt for a night, but healing comes in the morning. Whatever you're carrying, Pastor, it's time to lay it down." James couldn't speak. It was as if Alois had read the letter herself, had seen into the turmoil of his soul. "Thank you, Sister Jackson," he finally managed to say. I'll keep that in mind." Alois nodded, apparently satisfied. As she rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Oh, and Pastor. There's a young man in the sanctuary. Says he's never been here before but felt compelled to come today. Might want to welcome him before the service. Seems lost, that one. Name's Marcus, I believe." The name hit James like a physical blow. Marcus, it couldn't be, not today, not here. "Thank you," he said mechanically. "I'll see to it." After Alois left, James sat frozen behind his desk. Marcus Johnson was here, in his church, on this day of all days. It couldn't be coincidence. Nothing in James's faith allowed for such coincidences. With trembling hands, he took out the letter again and reread it. Yes, the boy was 17, born in December 2007. The timing aligned with that brief relationship with Vanessa. And now, as if guided by an unseen hand, the boy had found his way to Grace Baptist on the very day of James's retirement. "Lord, what are you doing?" James whispered. The clock on the wall showed 9:45 a.m. The service would begin in 15 minutes. James had a choice to make: ignore the boy's presence and proceed with his final sermon as planned, or confront this situation head-on. He closed his eyes and prayed for guidance. The sermon he had prepared suddenly seemed irrelevant in the face of this development. If this truly was his son sitting out there in the sanctuary, didn't he owe the boy the truth? Didn't he owe his congregation the truth? But such a revelation would change everything. His legacy at Grace Baptist, the respect he had earned over 30 years of ministry, the image of the faithful husband and family man, all of it could be tarnished in an instant. And what about Leanne, his daughter with Martha? She was 35 now, a professor at a university in North Carolina. How would she feel learning she had a half-brother she'd never known about, that her father had kept such a secret? The clock ticked closer to 10:00 a.m. James knew he needed to make a decision. With a deep breath, he stood up, straightened his tie, and picked up his Bible, the letter still tucked inside. "Your will, not mine, Lord," he whispered. As James made his way to the sanctuary, his heart pounded. Would he recognize the boy? Would he see Vanessa in him? Or more frighteningly, would he see himself? The sanctuary was nearly full now. Grace Baptist could seat 400, and it looked like every seat would be filled today. James spotted familiar faces, members who had been with him since the beginning, children he had dedicated who were now adults with children of their own, people he had counseled through grief and celebrated within joy. And then he saw him, sitting alone in the back row. A young black teenager, maybe 17 or 18, with a serious expression and eyes that looked vaguely familiar. James felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath him. There was no denying it, the boy looked like a younger version of himself. Before James could decide whether to approach him, Deacon Lewis was at his side. 10 minutes, Pastor," Robert said. "Choir's ready. Sister Campbell said they'll open with Amazing Grace and then do their special number after the scripture reading." James nodded absently, his eyes still on the boy. "You see a ghost or something?" Robert asked, following James's gaze. "Something like that," James murmured. "Robert, do you see that young man in the back? The one sitting alone?" Robert looked. "Sure, don't recognize him, new to the church." "Very new," James said. "I need to speak with him right now." "Service starts in 10 minutes, James," Robert reminded him. "I know, this won't take long." Before Robert could object further, James was making his way down the aisle toward the back of the sanctuary. Congregants greeted him as he passed, offering congratulations and well wishes, but James barely heard them. His focus was entirely on the young man who might be his son. As James approached, the teenager looked up, a mixture of nervousness and determination on his face. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking. The shape of his eyes, the set of his jaw, it was like looking at an old photograph of himself. "Good morning," James said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm Pastor Wilson." The young man stood, extending his hand. "Marcus Johnson," he said. I've never been here before. My grandmother suggested I come, said it might help." James shook the boy's hand, feeling a connection that transcended the physical touch. "Help with what, if you don't mind my asking?" Marcus hesitated. "My mom died 3 months ago, cancer. Before she died, she told me something about my father, my real father." James felt lightheaded. Here it was, the moment of truth, happening in the back of his sanctuary minutes before his retirement ceremony. "Did she now?" he managed to say. "And what did she tell you?" "That his name was James Wilson, that he was studying to be a pastor in Atlanta when they met, that he never knew about me." Marcus looked directly into James's eyes. "Are you him?" The directness of the question caught James off guard. He had expected more time, more conversation, more dancing around the issue. But here was this boy, his son, cutting straight to the heart of the matter. Before James could respond, the organ began to play, signaling the start of the service. Sister Campbell was at the piano and the choir was taking their places. "I need to start the service," James said, avoiding the question. "We can talk after if you'll stay." "I'll stay," Marcus said firmly. "I've been looking for you for 3 months." James nodded, then made his way to the pulpit, his mind racing. The sanctuary was full now, the congregation buzzing with anticipation for this milestone service. The retirement of Pastor James Wilson after 30 years of faithful ministry to Grace Baptist Church. Little did they know that today's service would be about so much more than a retirement. As the choir sang, "Amazing Grace," James tried to gather his thoughts. The sermon he had prepared no longer seemed appropriate. How could he stand before his congregation and preach about truth and integrity while harboring such a significant secret? Especially now that the subject of that secret was sitting in his sanctuary. After the opening hymn, Deacon Lewis led the congregation in prayer, followed by the scripture reading from Sister Campbell. Then the choir performed their special number, a beautiful arrangement of "Great is Thy Faithfulness" that normally would have moved James to tears. Today, however, he barely heard it. His mind was consumed with what he should do. Then it was time. Deacon Lewis introduced him, listing his accomplishments and contributions to the church and community over 3 decades. The congregation applauded as James approached the pulpit. "Thank you, Deacon Lewis, for those kind words," James began, looking out at the faces of people who had become like family to him. His eyes found Marcus in the back row, watching intently. "And thank you, members and friends of Grace Baptist, for 30 wonderful years." James had planned to begin with an anecdote about his first Sunday at Grace Baptist, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself gripping the sides of the pulpit, a sudden clarity washing over him. "I had a sermon prepared for today," he said. "A nice, safe sermon about faith and perseverance and God's faithfulness through the years. But standing here now, I feel compelled to speak about something else, something more personal." A hush fell over the congregation. This was not the nostalgic, celebratory address they had expected. "The Bible tells us in John 8:32 that the truth shall make you free. I've preached that verse many times over the years, but I haven't always lived it." From the front row, Deacon Lewis gave him a puzzled look. Sister Jackson, however, nodded slightly as if she had been expecting this. 40 years ago," James continued, "before I came to Grace Baptist, before many of you knew me, I was a different man. I was a theology student in Atlanta, wrestling with my calling, questioning my faith. My wife Martha and I, God rest her soul, were separated at the time. It was the lowest point in my life." The congregation was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This was not the kind of personal revelation Pastor Wilson typically shared. "During that time, I made choices I'm not proud of, choices that contradicted the very gospel I was studying to preach. And those choices had consequences I wasn't aware of until very recently." James paused, his eyes again finding Marcus in the back row. The young man sat perfectly still, his expression unreadable. Before James could continue, there was a commotion at the back of the sanctuary. A church usher was making his way down the aisle, holding a white envelope. He approached the pulpit and handed it to James. "Came by courier, Pastor," the usher whispered. "Said it was urgent." James thanked him and opened the envelope, puzzled by the interruption. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a DNA test result from a laboratory in Atlanta. James scanned the contents, his heart racing. The test compared the DNA of Marcus Johnson with a sample from James Wilson. The result, a 99.9% probability of paternity. James stared at the paper, unable to process what he was seeing. How was this possible? He hadn't submitted any DNA sample. Then he noticed a note at the bottom of the page. Pastor Wilson, we obtained your DNA from a coffee cup you discarded at our office last week when you came to inquire about Mr. Johnson's case. We apologize for the deception, but our client deserved certainty. Bradley, Wung, and Associates, James remembered the meeting now. He had gone to the law firm after receiving their letter, claiming he was merely trying to help locate the James Wilson that Vanessa Johnson had named. The receptionist had offered him coffee while he waited. They had planned this. James looked up from the paper to find the entire congregation watching him, confusion evident on their faces. His eyes found Marcus again, and this time the boy was standing, as if sensing that something significant had just happened. "Pastor," Deacon Lewis prompted from the front row, "is everything all right?" James took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. God had orchestrated this moment, had brought his son to his church on this day, had arranged for the DNA results to arrive during his final sermon. Who was he to fight against such divine intervention? "No, Robert," James said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Everything is not all right, but by God's grace it will be." He held up the paper. "This is a DNA test result. It confirms that I am the biological father of a young man named Marcus Johnson. A young man I never knew existed until yesterday. A young man who, by what can only be described as a miracle, is sitting in our sanctuary right now." A collective gasp rose from the congregation. Heads turned to look at Marcus, who remained standing, his face a mixture of shock and vindication. "Marcus," James called out, "would you please come forward?" The sanctuary was so quiet you could hear Marcus's footsteps as he made his way down the aisle. James stepped down from the pulpit to meet him at the front of the church. Standing face to face with his son for the first time, James was overwhelmed by emotion. "I didn't know," he whispered, for Marcus's ears only. "I swear to you I didn't know." "My mom said you wouldn't," Marcus replied. "She didn't tell you. She found out she was pregnant after you had gone back to your wife. She didn't want to complicate things." James nodded, fighting back tears. Then, aware of the hundreds of eyes on them, he turned to address the congregation again, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Church family, this is Marcus Johnson. As the DNA test confirms, he is my biological son, conceived during a period of separation from my late wife Martha. I never knew of his existence until yesterday, when I received a letter from a law firm representing him." The congregation remained silent, processing this revelation. James could see the shock on many faces, confusion on others, but it was Sister Jackson who spoke first. "Praise God," the elderly woman said, rising from her seat with the help of her cane. "The Lord told me you'd be facing a reckoning today, Pastor Wilson, and he told me to tell you that truth might hurt for a night, but healing comes in the morning." "Yes, Sister Jackson," James acknowledged. "Your words this morning were prophetic, as they often are." He turned back to the congregation. "I stand before you today not just as your retiring pastor, but as a man in need of forgiveness. I've preached about integrity for 30 years while keeping this secret buried. Not because I was ashamed of this young man, how could I be, when I didn't know he existed, but because I was ashamed of the choices that led to his conception, choices that contradicted the very gospel I preach." James's hands trembled as he gripped the wooden pulpit. The magnificent stained glass windows of Grace Baptist Church cast colored shadows across his face, highlighting the tears that now streamed down his weathered cheeks. The congregation sat in stunned silence, many with mouths agape, others with hands covering their faces. "I've kept this secret for 40 years, Pastor Wilson said, his voice cracking. "And I never imagined that God would reveal it like this. Not today, not during my last sermon." The old pastor looked to his right where Marcus stood frozen in shock, his face ashen. The teenager had come to the church that morning only because his grandmother had insisted. He hadn't expected to be standing before the entire congregation, hadn't expected to be at the center of what many would later call a miracle. Behind Marcus stood Mrs. Alois Jackson, the church's eldest member at 93 years old. Her walking cane had clattered to the floor moments earlier, and now she pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, then at Pastor Wilson. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. "It's him, the spitting image. Lord have mercy." The sanctuary had gone from celebration to chaos in seconds. What had begun as Pastor Wilson's retirement ceremony after 30 years of service had turned into something no one could have predicted. The white envelope that had been delivered to the pulpit mid-sermon now lay open on the floor, its contents changing everything. Pastor Wilson looked out at the sea of confused faces, his heart pounding so hard he feared it might give out right there. He was 72 years old with a heart condition, and the doctor had warned him about stress. But this was beyond anything he could have prepared for. "I know you all have questions," he said, struggling to regain his composure. "I have them too. But now you understand what happened earlier, and I need to finish what I started." James took a deep breath, steadying himself against the pulpit. The weight of 3 decades of ministry and 4 decades of secrecy seemed to press down on his shoulders, but there was also a strange lightness beginning to spread through his chest, the lightness that comes with unburdening one's soul. "Some of you may be disappointed in me," he continued. "Some may feel I've betrayed your trust. I understand that. But I stand before you today not as a perfect man, but as a forgiven one. The same grace that saved me all those years ago is the grace I cling to now." From the front row, Deacon Lewis stood up. The sanctuary grew tense. Robert Lewis was known for his strict moral code and traditional values. If anyone would condemn James for this revelation, it would be him. "Pastor Wilson," Robert began, his deep voice filling the sanctuary, "for 30 years I've sat under your teaching. I've watched you counsel the broken, comfort the grieving, celebrate with the joyful. I've seen you live out the gospel day after day, year after year." James braced himself for what would come next. "And in all that time," Robert continued, "the message you preached most consistently was that God's grace is bigger than our mistakes, that no sin is beyond his forgiveness, that the blood of Jesus covers all." The deacon's voice grew thick with emotion. "If that's true for the rest of us, it's true for you too. You've been more than a pastor to this church. You've been a friend, a brother, a father figure to many, including me, and I for one am not about to throw away 30 years of faithful ministry over something that happened before you even came to Grace Baptist." A murmur of agreement spread through the congregation. James felt tears threatening again. "Thank you, Robert," he managed to say. "Your friendship has meant more to me than you know." But not everyone was as forgiving as Deacon Lewis. From the middle of the sanctuary, Sister Pauline Waters stood up. At 70, she was one of the church's most outspoken members, known for her strong opinions and traditional values. "I don't mean to cause trouble," she began, though everyone knew that was exactly what she intended. "But I have to ask, if Pastor Wilson could keep this kind of secret for 40 years, what else might he be hiding? How can we trust anything he's told us?" The question hung in the air, harsh and accusatory. James felt a stab of pain, not because the question was unfair, but because it echoed his own fears. How many times had he asked himself the same thing over the years? How many sleepless nights had he spent wrestling with his conscience? Before James could respond, Marcus stepped forward. The teenager who had been silent throughout this public revelation now moved to stand beside his newly discovered father. "You don't know me," Marcus said, his voice surprisingly steady for someone addressing hundreds of strangers. "And I didn't know Pastor Wilson until today, but I know this. My mother spoke of him with respect. She told me he was a good man who was going through a difficult time when they met. She never blamed him for what happened, and she never regretted having me." The sanctuary was completely silent as Marcus continued. "3 months ago, on her deathbed, my mom told me who my real father was. She said she'd kept it from me because she didn't want to disrupt his life or ministry. But she also said that if I ever needed him, I should find him, that he would do the right thing because that's the kind of man he is." Marcus turned to look at James. "I didn't come here today to expose him or to cause trouble. I came because I lost my mom and I wanted to know where I came from, who I came from." The simple honesty of the boy's words touched something deep in James's heart. In that moment, he saw not just Vanessa and Marcus, but himself too, the same straightforwardness, the same quiet dignity. "Thank you, Marcus," James said. Then, addressing the congregation again, "Sister Waters raises a fair question. Trust is earned, and I understand why some of you might feel that trust has been broken today. All I can say is this: I've tried to serve God and this church faithfully for 30 years. I've made mistakes, this revelation makes that clear, but I've never intentionally led any of you astray, and I've never preached anything I didn't believe with my whole heart." Sister Jackson spoke up again from her seat near the front. "Pastor Wilson, do you remember what you told us when you first came to Grace Baptist? You said, 'I'm not here to be your perfect pastor. I'm here to point you to our perfect Savior.' That's what you've done for 30 years. And that's what you're doing right now, by admitting your imperfection and trusting in God's grace." A chorus of amens rippled through the sanctuary. The tension began to dissipate, replaced by a spirit of reflection and, surprisingly, worship. "Church family," James said, "this is not how I expected my final sermon to go, but perhaps it's exactly what God intended. My ministry began with an act of grace, God calling a broken, imperfect man to preach his perfect gospel. It seems fitting that it should end the same way. James looked at Marcus, standing tall and dignified beside him. And in his infinite wisdom, God has given me a gift I never expected, a son. A son I never knew, but who I want to know now if he'll allow it. Marcus nodded, a small smile touching his lips. So what happens now? James asked, addressing both the congregation and himself. I don't have all the answers. This is new territory for all of us. But I know this, God is not surprised by any of this. He knew this day was coming long before any of us did. James paused, a new thought occurring to him. In fact, I believe God orchestrated this entire situation. Think about it. What are the odds that my son would find his way to this church on the very day of my retirement? That the DNA results would arrive during my final sermon? That Sister Jackson would receive a prophetic word about a reckoning this morning? This is not coincidence. This is divine intervention. A sense of awe fell over the sanctuary as people considered his words. Even Sister Waters, who had questioned James's integrity moments earlier, seemed thoughtful now. I believe, James continued, his voice growing stronger, that God wanted this truth revealed not just for Marcus's sake or for mine, but for all of our sakes, to remind us that none of us is beyond the need for grace, that no secret is beyond his knowing, that no broken relationship is beyond his power to heal. The congregation began to nod in agreement. Something was happening in the sanctuary, a shift in atmosphere, a softening of hearts. So I stand before you today not as Pastor James Wilson, the man who led this church for 30 years without a blemish, but as James Wilson, a sinner saved by grace, a man in need of forgiveness, a father meeting his son for the first time. James extended his hand to Marcus, who took it without hesitation. And I ask for your prayers as we navigate this new relationship, as we discover what it means to be father and son after all these years. Deacon Lewis stood again. Pastor Wilson, I think I speak for most of us when I say you have our prayers and our support. This doesn't erase 30 years of faithful ministry. If anything, it makes your message of grace all the more powerful because now we see how personally you've experienced it. Murmurs of agreement spread through the congregation, but Sister Waters wasn't finished. She stood again, her expression less harsh than before, but still concerned. I appreciate what you're saying, Deacon Lewis, and I don't dispute Pastor Wilson's years of service, but there's still the matter of the example being set. What message does this send to our young people? That you can make mistakes and just hide them for decades. It was a fair question, and James knew it deserved a thoughtful answer. But before he could speak, Sister Jackson was on her feet again, surprisingly spry for 93. The message, Sister Waters, is that our God is bigger than our mistakes. That grace is real, not just a theological concept. That confession brings healing, even if it's 40 years late. She turned to face the congregation. I've lived long enough to see preachers fall and never get back up. I've seen ministries destroyed by scandal. But what we're witnessing today isn't a scandal. It's a testimony. A testimony to the God who redeems our mistakes and works all things together for good for those who love him. The sanctuary erupted in applause and amens. Even Sister Waters seemed moved, reluctantly nodding her acknowledgement of the wisdom in the elderly woman's words. As the applause died down, James felt a hand on his arm. It was Marcus, looking at him with an expression that mingled wonder and uncertainty. Can I say something? Marcus asked quietly. James nodded and stepped back from the pulpit, allowing his son to take his place. The congregation grew quiet, eager to hear what this young man, this living revelation, had to say. My name is Marcus Johnson, he began, his voice echoing through the sanctuary. Until today, I thought I knew who I was. I'm a senior in high school. I play basketball. I want to study engineering in college. I had a mom who loved me and raised me by herself, and a man I thought was my father who left when I was 2. Marcus paused, gathering his thoughts. 3 months ago, my mom told me the truth. She was dying, and she didn't want to take this secret to her grave. She told me about a young theology student named James Wilson who she'd loved briefly during a difficult time in his life. She told me he never knew about me, that she'd made the decision to keep me a secret to protect his marriage and his calling. The sanctuary was completely silent as Marcus continued. At first, I was angry at my mom for keeping this from me, angry at Pastor Wilson for not being there even though I knew it wasn't his fault, angry at God for taking my mom and leaving me alone to figure all this out. Marcus's voice broke slightly, and he took a moment to compose himself. After the funeral, I found a letter my mom had written me. In it, she explained more about her relationship with Pastor Wilson. She said he was a good man who had lost his way temporarily. She said she had no regrets about their time together because it gave her me. And she said that if I ever needed a father, I should find him. He looked at James, standing just a few feet away. So I hired a private investigator. Found out Pastor Wilson had become the pastor of Grace Baptist Church in Claiborne, discovered he was retiring today, and something told me I needed to be here. Marcus turned back to the congregation. I didn't come to cause trouble, I just wanted to see him, maybe talk to him after the service. I never expected this. He gestured to the sanctuary, to the situation unfolding around them. But now that it's happening, I feel like my mom was right. This is a good man. I can see it in how you all look at him, in how he's handled this situation. And I'd like the chance to get to know him if that's okay with everyone. The simple honesty of the request touched something deep in the hearts of those present. This wasn't a scandal or a soap opera. It was a young man who had lost his mother and was searching for connection, for family, for identity. James stepped forward and placed his arm around Marcus's shoulders. It's more than okay with me, son, he said, the word son carrying a weight and meaning it had never held before. And I believe it's okay with most of the people here, too. He looked out at the congregation, at the faces of people he had baptized, married, buried, counseled, and loved for 3 decades. This church has always been a family. Today, that family just got a little bigger. Deacon Lewis stood and began to applaud, and soon the entire congregation was on its feet. The applause turned to cheers, and the cheers gave way to spontaneous singing as someone began, "Amazing Grace." The choir joined in, followed by the congregation, and soon the sanctuary was filled with the sound of hundreds of voices united in the hymn that had comforted generations of believers. As they sang, James felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced in decades. The secret he had carried for so long, not the existence of Marcus, which he hadn't known, but the moral failure that had led to his conception, was now in the open. And rather than condemnation, he had found grace. Grace from his congregation, grace from his newfound son, and most importantly, grace from the God he had served imperfectly but faithfully for 40 years. When the hymn ended, James returned to the pulpit, Marcus still by his side. Church family, this is not the retirement ceremony we planned, but I believe it's the one God ordained. And while I don't know exactly what the future holds for Marcus and me, or for this church under Pastor Taylor's leadership, I know this. The same God who has been faithful for the past 30 years will be faithful for the next 30 and beyond. He looked at Marcus, then back at the congregation. So I leave you with the same message I've tried to share for 30 years. God's grace is bigger than our mistakes. His love is deeper than our failures, and His plan is wiser than our understanding. As James concluded his final sermon, a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds outside and streamed through the stained glass windows, bathing the pulpit in a rainbow of colors. Some would later call it a coincidence, but for those present in the sanctuary of Grace Baptist Church that day, it felt like a divine affirmation, a visible manifestation of the grace that had just been demonstrated. In the weeks and months that followed, James and Marcus began the slow, sometimes awkward, but ultimately rewarding process of building a relationship. Marcus moved into James's home after graduation, and they spent the summer getting to know each other before Marcus left for college in the fall. The congregation of Grace Baptist, after the initial shock wore off, embraced Marcus as one of their own, seeing in him not a scandal but a testimony to God's redemptive power. James's daughter Leanne, after her own period of adjustment to the news of a half-brother, eventually welcomed Marcus into her life as well. The family that James had thought complete was expanded in ways he could never have imagined. And Sister Alois Jackson, at 93, lived long enough to see what she called the miracle of Grace Baptist, not just the revelation of Pastor Wilson's secret son, but the healing and restoration that followed. "The Lord told me there'd be a reckoning," she would often say. "But He also promised healing in the morning, and ain't that just like our God? To take our biggest mistakes and turn them into our greatest testimonies." As for Pastor James Wilson, his retirement was not the quiet, uneventful transition he had anticipated. Instead, it became the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with the joy of knowing his son, the freedom of living without secrets, and the deepened understanding of the grace he had preached for so many years. What had begun as a potential scandal had been transformed, through God's sovereign orchestration, into a powerful testimony that would be retold for generations to come. The story of a pastor's last sermon, a son's timely arrival, and the miracle of divine grace that bound them together in ways no one could have predicted. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.